Legends. This is November 1970. We're talking from Oklahoma Christian College. We are interviewing Colonel Thomas P. Stafford, who was one of our esteemed astronauts and a man who is a native of Oklahoma. Living Legends. This is November 1970. We're talking from Oklahoma Christian College. We are interviewing Colonel Thomas P. Stafford, who was one of our esteemed astronauts and a man who is a native of Oklahoma, a native of Weatherford, Oklahoma, who was the command pilot of Apollo 10. We will be asking Colonel Stafford to give some of his reminiscences, particularly from the standpoint of his Oklahoma background. Colonel Stafford, to begin, I wonder if you'd tell us a little bit about where you were born, who your parents were, and just a little about your family background.
Certainly. My mother came to Oklahoma before the turn of the century when it was still Indian territory with her family from Kansas City, and they homesteaded out in Ellis County. Her name was Mary Ellen Patton. My father graduated from Vanderbilt University from the dental school in 1912 and moved to Oklahoma in 1913 and practiced dentistry by actually going between three small cities, spending 2 days a week there between Buffalo, Beaver, and Laverne.
His
name was Dr. Thomas Sabert Stafford.
Are your parents living now either?
My mother's still living. They were later married in Woodward, Oklahoma, and then moved to Weatherford in approximately 1921, and I was born in 1930.
How many brothers or sisters do you have?
I'm the only child.
You're the only child, and you were born in 1930.
Right.
You attended the schools at Weatherford.
That's correct. Started kindergarten at Weatherford and then went all the way through.
I wonder if you could recall in your school career, possibly in your grade school and then your high school, any outstanding experiences that you recall during your schooling period in Weatherford.
Well, there were so many different experiences that were so interesting. It's hard to say that one or two was outstanding. To me, I always liked the two parts of school. I liked the academic part and also loved athletics. And we had a junior high football team, and that was organized, I think, for the first time. And now it's commonplace to have a junior high football team. Also, I participated in the meets at Southwestern State College each spring in their academic meets called the Southwestern Intercollegiate meets there.
What did you compete in?
In mathematics and physics.
When did you begin to gain an interest in math?
Well, I guess even from the earliest days. Even though Father was a dentist, he always liked mathematics and always taught me at the earliest age. And I like, to me, mathematics always had a lot of logic, the way you could put things together. And I like to just, it always gave me a great satisfaction to solve mathematics.
Do you recall any particular individuals, teachers, or others who, other than your father, or in addition to your father, who may have had an influence on your interest?
Well, there were two mathematics teachers that did. One was Dr. Lewis Morris, who was he was a junior high principal, and then he's also the mathematics instructor. He's now the dean of men at Southwestern State College. The other one was Mrs. Letha Spann, and who was the high school mathematics instructor.
Can you think of any other teachers that you had who may have had influence of particular importance in other areas?
Well, the English teacher was Miss Dora Mae Mitchell, who later instructed in the university in West Virginia and is now retired in Clinton, Oklahoma.
Mm-hmm.
But Miss Mitchell gave me a great appreciation for literature.
Mm-hmm. You were a member of the Boy Scout troop. I don't remember the number. Could you tell about your Scout troop?
I joined I was a member of the Cub Scouts, and then when I became of age, I joined the Boy Scouts, and the troop number was 355. And I progressed from a tenderfoot up to the grade of Star Scout. At that time, I finally terminated my direct association with the Scouts due to all the time I was spending in athletics in high school.
Mm-hmm. Could you comment on the Boy Scout organization and any influence it may have
Well,
had?
it was, to me, one of the greatest influence of the Boy Scout program of America is the fact that it takes an individual, and it's really one of the first times he's on his own, he learns to become self-sufficient. So I think it really serves a great function in our country.
Do you feel that there are any areas in which your Boy Scout training may have helped you in your later at the academy and in your later career as an Air Force officer?
Yes, I think definitely, again, what I said, that one of self-sufficiency, one of working with others, and learning how that you should always work as a goal and teamwork.
It may be of interest to you that there were patrol of boys from Troop 355 at the National Jamboree in Idaho, and they were wearing the Apollo 10 patch that you brought back from your flight.
Right. The Scoutmaster asked me if we'd carry those out to the moon. I thought we'd be more than glad to.
Well, they were very proud. We're very proud of those. Could you talk about the football coaches or the other athletic coaches you had, and who they were, and what influence they may have had on you?
In junior high school, we had our first coach was named Mr. Rice, and he coached both football and basketball, which was quite common out there. There was not one coach specifically for a specific sport. Then later on in high school, we had Brooks, we had Wilson. The last one was Steve Graham, and he probably had the most influence on me at all. It was his first team that he coached after graduating from Southwestern, and so he had a lot of red-blooded American boys he had to wheel into a unit, and it was quite a break-in experience for him, but it was a good team. And later on, Steve has been named Coach of the Year both in Oklahoma and now in New Mexico.
What kind of a record did your football team have?
5-4.
5-4. Mm-hmm. Do you feel that your athletic experience has had any influence on your later life and your later achievement?
Oh, definitely it has. The main thing that when you're working with in a real competitive sport, you have to work with personalities, and you have to understand what motivates the people. And when things are going against you and things are really rough, you have to understand what is the motivating factor and how do you take those people and have them all work together as a team to get the most out of them, the drive. And this is certainly true today. Even the job I have today as the head of the astronaut group. I have to really watch at each individual, their personality, and how you keep the motivation factor there.
You have been involved in various competitive things all of your life. You're both in the scholastic and the mathematics, in football, and in other things. Do you feel or would you like to comment on what you feel may be the effect or value of competition to an individual?
Well, I think competition is one of the great ways of American life. I think it's what's made the human race have some of the great progress. But when competition becomes excessive, then I think it serves no useful purpose. But I think good, healthy competition without involving, becoming personal, I think that's fine.
You took the examination, I presume, to go to the Naval Academy?
Right, when I was in high school.
What gave you the idea or the motivation to decide you wanted to go to the Naval Academy?
Well, I guess I'd always had a fascination about ships. I grew up in the Dust Bowl in western Oklahoma. The largest body of water out there was Deer Creek, which you could walk across most of the time. But no, there was just something, I guess, that a faraway place and just a new adventure, something that I wanted to try.
What do you think gave you the ship? Had you done any reading about ships?
I'd read about ships.
I see, and that was your interest. And then
well, ships and I'd read about airplanes, and I'd finally had one flight, and I was fascinated with that too.
When did you shift from ships to planes? Obviously, you did before you graduated.
During my time at the Naval Academy, after becoming closely associated with both ships and planes and aircraft, so there was no doubt which interest I wanted to pursue.
At what point in the Naval Academy did you make this determination?
Oh, probably at the end of my second year there. So for the last 2 years, for
I see.
sure, I wanted to go fly.
You graduated, I believe, before the Air Force Academy was
Yes,
created.
sir, right. We graduated 7 years before the Air Force Academy produced their first class.
So you had a choice.
Right, I had the choice of the Air Force, the Marine Corps, the Navy.
Mm-hmm. You chose the Air Force.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Swinging back into Oklahoma, we may go back again further into the space experience, but are there any ways that you feel that your Oklahoma background itself was of help to you in your career?
Certainly. I think by growing up in a small town, Weatherford was 2,000 when I can first remember it, and it's now about 8,000. But we were not involved with any of the problems that you see that have accompanied the late 60s and the early 70s, particularly of a big city. Weatherford is completely devoid of that. And an individual could pursue his own interest there without any constraining influences. And so I've always thought one of the greatest assets I've had was to grow up in a small town.
Oklahoma's had several astronauts, 2 of whom have made space flights. Would you like to comment on any of the other Oklahomans who are in the space program?
Well, as you know, Gordon Cooper was the first Oklahoman to fly, and he flew the last Mercury flight. He also flew the 3rd Gemini flight, Gemini 5. And then I flew 2 Gemini flights. One was a pilot, one was a commander, and then Apollo 10, and now I'm in charge of the whole astronaut group. The other ones are Owen Garriott from Enid, Oklahoma, who was a scientist astronaut. From Sand Springs, Bill Pogue, who was a test pilot. Bill Pogue also flew with the Thunderbirds, who was the Air Force acrobatic team, and then he went to the Empire Test Pilot School in England instead of the Air Force Test Pilot School and Exchange Program, and was later an instructor at the Air Force School, just like I was. And we hope that both of these gentlemen will fly in Skylab. Now, there's also some other people that have had parents that they call Oklahoma home, like Ed Mitchell. Was born in Oklahoma. In fact, he was born the same day in 1930 that I was, but he never grew up here. Fred Hayes went to Oklahoma University.
It's rather interesting, and I think significant that so many Oklahomans have made the space team. Do you can you attribute that to any reason to that?
I think that Oklahoma has always had a consciousness of, let's say, exploration. I think they've had one that definitely tended towards interest in aircraft and flying.
Mm-hmm. Do you feel that the Oklahoma environment is conducive to possibly to the disciplines and the other things that can become involved in?
I believe so, but again, to excel in college, to really excel in flying, I mean, be at the top of the flying profession, and to be an astronaut, it takes a lot of discipline. And I think the background and the bringing up in Oklahoma certainly is a major factor in that.
Have you had close relationships with any of these other astronauts, or any experiences? I'm thinking in terms of maybe a funny experience, maybe or anything else. A chance to tell a story on what if you want to, of any of the other Oklahomans involved.
Well, the one I know best by far is Gordon Cooper.
Mm-hmm. Would you like to talk about him a little?
Well, I think Gordo was always a great practical joker, and it's before Alan Shepard's flight, the first time we sent a man into space on a short 15-minute suborbital flight, and they wanted some pictures for the press in a television medium of the astronaut getting in the elevator to go up the gantry. But Shepard was busy, in a training, so what they did, they put Gordo in one of Al's suits and showed him going down there, and they had the whole entourage of cars, the guards, and he got ready, and he had this worked out with some of the suit technicians and a couple of guards. When he suddenly got up to the door of the elevator, he put his hands out like he was afraid he wasn't going to go. He put his hands out and just stopped, and they kept pushing on him and heaving, and finally they picked him up and threw him in the elevator, and they ran inside and closed the doors and up. And needless to say, all the public relations people went wild on that one, and it got up to Mr. Webb, the administrator, and there was great repercussions on that.
Mr. Webb, incidentally, is an Oklahoman, or had spent quite a bit of time in Oklahoma.
Right. He's a native Carolina, but had worked here for several years in Oklahoma as a business executive.
Mm-hmm.
He was a great man, and he certainly contributed a lot as far as the formation of NASA.
Mm-hmm. From the standpoint of interesting stories that affected any of the Oklahomans, including yourself, any of the funny situations, take yourself in your experience as an astronaut. What would you say to begin with was the funniest experience you may have run across?
We've had some great ones. I think one of the best ones we've had, it was planned, was when we completed the first rendezvous in space. As you know, in the Gemini program, I had 3 final counts on each one of my missions before we finally got off. And this was due to either a booster would malfunction and not make it into orbit, or an Agena rocket would blow up. And we finally are going to rendezvous on Gemini 7. That would have been up for 12 days. And on board Gemini 7 was Jim Lovell, who was a classmate of mine from the Naval Academy, and Frank Borman, who was from West Point. Now, Wally Schirra was the commander, I was a pilot. We're both in the Naval Academy. And our flight crew director at that time was Alan Shepard, Naval Academy graduate. And what we did was cut out on the size of cardboard, the exact size of my Gemini one, and then on top of it we had a blue background, and then in gold it had Beat Army. This was just about the time of the Army-Navy game. And so here, you know, the big suspense and all that, and we finally lifted off. There's a lot of pressure on to do that rendezvous, because this was what the whole lunar mission was premised upon, was we could do a lunar orbit rendezvous. And all the hardware was built on it. If we had had a difficult time doing the rendezvous, if we had proven that the rendezvous was not feasible, well, we just shot about $10 billion. And so there's a lot of pressure on, but you know, it came off just right on the money. And we did it, and we got there, we're flying formation just a couple of feet away. And I told Jim Lovell that the doctors were, you know, concerned about his vision after 12 days of weightlessness, and that they wanted to give him a visual acuity test. I wanted to read the signs. He said, all right, and we could see Jim. He's a real scroungy-looking character. He had 12 days of beard on. You know, he was in the other spacecraft about 10 feet away, and so I said, now, can you read down? We made sure we were in the United States when we did this, so I flashed it up and says, what does it say? And he said, he yelled out, you know, Beat Army, you know, and he snapped a picture of it. And the basic card that I carried there is back in the Naval Academy Museum. so that was a good one we played. You know, if you didn't have a few jokes with all the pressure you're under and all the long hours you keep, you know, it'd just be impossible to stand it. So you got to have a few laughs.
That's a good one. Can you think of any others?
Why don't we cut from
Okay. Well, let's we'll swing into something.
Oh,
else
okay. You got
back.
plenty of tape.
Sure.
Oh,
always
okay.
plenty. There's no problem. So we'll swing back. We'll swing back if you think of another one. But let's take. You have you've had some very serious situations, obvious, and a lot of them that we know about because we were sweating it out, watching it on television. But could you talk about what you feel was the most tense situation and how you felt at the time, and could you describe that?
Well, I've had several. Again, trying to get off on the first rendezvous in space. And, I don't know if you remember this, but finally, one Sunday morning we're going to fly, and final countdown. You know, minus 3 seconds, you could feel the thing start to vibrate as the turbine started to spin up and the engines started to build up thrust. And then just before it got to zero, everything stopped. But we had the indication we'd lifted off. Now, in that case, you would have to eject instantaneously because the thing, even from a couple inches, would fall back, would just overstress and blow in 1,000 pieces. So anyway, Wally knew in his mind, I knew in my mind that we hadn't lifted off. You know. But there we were stuck up on top of the booster. You know, the engines had shut down. And the test conductor said, well, just stand by. We got a fire going down below. And so again, I said, well, why don't you put it out? You know? So that was one. The other one came about, I guess, when we were making a low pass over the moon. Actually, above some of the mountains, we're down to about 7.5 miles. And we were coming down, and this time it was on the second pass, and we were going upside down and backwards, So this was, again, just due to the guidance system and over the mechanics so we could stage. Getting ready to stage, and suddenly the vehicle started to spin end over end out of control. And I got under control in about 15 seconds. And Gene Cernan was looking outside. He suddenly saw the moon go whizzing past him, down low like that. It was quite an experience. Again, I didn't have time to be afraid or anything like that. It was I'd had some experiences like that in an aircraft at low altitude and got under control. So it was kind of like you'd been there before. This is why we tend to experience people up there.
Sometimes when something's happening, there's hardly time to be scared.
That's
do you
right.
feel it afterwards ever?
Oh, sure you do. Mm-hmm. Again, we've trained so much and are so disciplined that it doesn't have near the effect that a lot of people would have in the same experience that did not have the training.
We might break and have a cup of coffee. After a short break, we're back on in our interview with Colonel Tom Stafford. Colonel Stafford, right after you talked to the chapel program, one of the students asked you to comment on the fact that there was some criticism, particularly from an atheist group, about the comments of one of the astronauts, his giving scripture on when he was making his rounds on TV. I wonder if you might comment on that, on what effect this criticism and the counter criticism or the counter argument had on NASA, if any.
Well, the program has always been structured that the commander and the astronauts on board are responsible for all the transmissions. And there has never been any instruction as such to counter anything that we would want to do in good taste. And in spite of this individual who filed a suit in the United States Supreme Court prohibiting astronauts from reading the Bible, the response from that was so great. In fact, the letters that would come in would often be 3,000 and 4,000 to 1 in favor of us reading from the Bible, that again, we are certainly free to do anything in this nature we want to. In fact, one duty I have, a responsibility, as chief of the astronaut office, is to answer all the mail that comes in a supervised manner. In fact, we have often over 100,000 letters a month. And I remember that in several months, over 50,000 of those letters were from people who were advocating and supporting us in our prerogative to read the Bible from space.
What effect do you feel that the space experience, which is certainly being a new experience, a dangerous experience, sometimes some traumatic periods, how do you feel that this affects the spiritual feeling of the people who are involved?
I think very deeply. People said, "Do you believe in God?" Well, I have, as long as I can remember, when I was old enough to make a decision and had the logic to investigate it. And believe me, when you leave the Earth, first, when you fly in space around the Earth, it's pretty phenomenal. It's very hard to describe and really impact all the emotion that you feel. But also when you finally leave the Earth and you go out and you see the Earth the size of a baseball, there's 3 billion people back there, and on that small blue and white, sometimes occasional little spots of brown baseball, but therein has rested all the history that you've ever known and read about the history of man. And the day that there's 3 billion people there, there's no doubt about it. It's just a living fact. There's got to be a God there.
Do you feel that? Could you describe the Earth as you have slightly talking about the people, but from the physical appearance, the first time that you look down and see the Earth looking down at the Earth as we look at the moon, what's the reaction?
The first time that we that I finally left the Earth on a free return trajectory, I'd been in orbit twice before on both my missions, up to say 180 miles. And you can see the horizon out to about 900 miles. And again, you travel 3.5 miles a second. But when we made the burn to go to the moon, we were upside down. It seems like we're always doing things upside down in space. We're upside down over the Pacific Ocean at nighttime, and the the third stage of the Saturn lit off with a big bang, and we're slowly starting to accelerate. And you could tell the night air glow was down below us, and then suddenly here came the sunrise, and we were climbing into the sunrise. And when we finally shut off, we were only 100. We started 100 miles, only 170 miles. And then on a programmed maneuver, the booster with both the spacecraft turned away from the Earth, so the sun would be over our shoulder for the transposition and docking. In fact, when we showed that, that was the first time that we'd ever showed live color television from space. And I think most of you probably saw that when we docked the two vehicles. But all this time we never saw the Earth. We finally pulled our lunar module we called Snoopy out of the doghouse, the adapter, and moved away. We showed you the S4B, and then we turned around and we saw the Earth. Now this had been 2 hours after we made the maneuver to lose the Earth, and we hadn't seen it. And you really move out in 2 hours, you cover over 30,000 miles. And we turned back, and there was the Earth, the size of a basketball. And none of us could say anything, and you could see it getting smaller. And we knew that we were gone for one long ride then.
Could you talk about the experience of the splashdown? I mean, I know that there's
let me hit one thing in front of that. Around here you have moonrise and sunrise, but when you experience your first Earthrise, that's a phenomenal sight. Something else too. On the way to the moon, because of our trajectory and where the moon was so close to the sun, we never saw the moon until we got there. In fact, we'd been in pure daylight for 3 days, slowly rotating in a barbecue mode to dissipate the heat from the sun. And we knew from our flight plan that we should fall in the shadow of the moon, and after 3 days of pure sunlight, suddenly everything got dark, just boom. We looked around, it was dark and the stars came out. You looked around, we still couldn't see the moon. It was something big and it was black and it was out there, but you couldn't see it. So we said, well, we hope all our trajectory's right. So we got in this position to go upside down and backwards to burn the lunar orbit. And finally, about 40 seconds before we ignited the engine to pull in the lunar orbit, there was the moon right below us. It was just suddenly it was there, and it looked a heck of a lot closer than 60 miles, and it looked real weird in the early sunrise. And we had the maneuver, the burn we had to pull in the lunar orbit was about 6 minutes long. And as a commander, I had a hard time keeping everybody's head in the cockpit because, here's something you've never seen before, and I was monitoring a computer. John Young was on the left on the engine controls, and Gene Cernan had the electrical power and the height and the helium and the flow into the engine on the monitoring that propellant. But here's a critical burn, but we just had occasionally I could watch it sneak a glance out. It was like a little kid in a candy shop, really. But then we got squared away, and finally up came the first Earthrise. And again, that is so phenomenal. We'd seen the Earth get smaller and smaller, but then we finally disappeared. Then we saw it come up. Now, when you have an Earthrise come up, it comes up boom. Where a sunrise and a moonrise we see here just slowly comes up. I mean, in 8 seconds, the Earth is up, boom, and it just moves, and it's just it takes your breath away.
Could you describe a splashdown from the standpoint of being the one splashed down?
Well, re-entry is something you have to go through. So, to me, I've never had any dread of re-entry, but the main thing is after re-entry on those chutes. I've never had any concern about the fireball or the guidance or my ability to fly it. In fact, I still hold the overall record, along with Gene Cernan on Gemini 9. We splashed down 7 football fields length from our target. That's from firing retros over Australia, so 0.38 nautical miles. But the main thing you're concerned about are those chutes coming out. And once those chutes de-reef, in fact, when you're on the drogues, you're getting whipped around pretty bad. You're banged all over the place, and that's why you're strapped in tight. Then you get down to 25,000 feet, the relief valve goes, and your ears start to pop, and you squeeze your nose to clear your ears. And finally, at 10,000, the main chutes come out, but they're held together, so you won't have a big opening shock and can withstand the force. So the chutes are streamering, and suddenly a guillotine fires and cuts the cord, and boom, the chutes de-reef. It's just a nice gentle deceleration. That's the greatest deceleration in the world. Now, after that, you think the rest of it is anticlimactic, but there's splashdowns ahead, and every splashdown varies. My first one on Gemini 6 with Wally Schirra, we hit down with a little nice plop, and the nose dug underwater just a little bit, and then we popped up, and there we were, and the carrier was right by us. On Gemini 9, there's a big wind blowing, and it had a high sea state, and we were swinging back and forth on the parachute. And I remember my experiences from Gemini 6 from about 300 feet up. I said, well, Gene, it'll just be a very gentle splashdown. And then there was a tremendous crash. And we pulled over 10 Gs on that spacecraft. We ripped shingles off the bottom. It cracked my teeth. Gene's head went forward and hit the instrument panel, and we went about 8 feet under the water. Looking at the films, we could put a column of water in the air over 40 feet. See, we hit on the windward side of a wave and 90 degrees to it and a big splash. But on Apollo 10, we came down the Pacific Ocean, the whole world saw us there. It was nice and calm. Just a little splash, and it was all over. So every splashdown is different.
What about flying over Oklahoma? Have you are you ever conscious of in any of the flights of being over Oklahoma at that particular
Well,
time?
from the trajectories I've been on, as we came across, we're on the moon flight. We went around 1.5 times. So as we're coming up from southwest to northeast, as the node starts to regress back, we're just barely able to see we're just coming across the southern coast of Texas, and looking out way to the north, you can see the Red River. That's about as far as. Now later on in Skylab, we will go as far north as the Canadian border, but I've never flown over Oklahoma from space yet. I can just barely see it in an oblique angle.
You've made a number of talks on the subject of pride in Oklahoma. I wonder if you'd tell us some of the things that you have said in those talks.
Sure. Governor Bartlett started a campaign called his Okie campaign to help develop pride in Oklahoma. It's called Oklahoma Key to Industrial Enterprise, or you can say Improvement in Education. And it's been a very successful campaign, and it's offset some of the bad publicity we had back in the 30s, and I can barely remember those days. Now, about 3 weeks before the launch of Apollo 10, Dewey Bartlett called me at the Cape and wanted to know if I would take along an Okie pin out to the moon to help him in his program. And I said, certainly. He said, my roots were very deep in Oklahoma since my mother moved here before there was ever a state. And I said, in fact, why don't you send me a couple of more Okie pins and 2 Oklahoma flags? Because we just changed the flight plan, and we're going to take the ascent stage of the lunar module and fire it off around the sun forever on a propulsion test. I said I'll leave those Okie pins in there and that Oklahoma flag. So today, out in deep black space, forever going around the sun, are 2 Okie pins and 2 Oklahoma flags. And believe me, no other state in the Union has representation that high or that far out. And when I came back to Oklahoma, I went around and I talked to various groups and told them about my pride of being an Oklahoman and what I did as far as representing it on the flight, and also as far as putting representation around the sun forever and from Oklahoma. I don't think any other state will ever have that opportunity. But I think that the progress that Oklahoma has made has been phenomenal in the last 30 years, 40 years. And I know that all the people from here are extremely proud of the state. We've made a lot of progress, and I think the progress we're going to make in the future is even more so.
How many, you've talked to quite a number of groups, and I believe you're talking today to a group in Eufaula, is that correct?
That's correct.
What is that group?
Well, this group is the Association for Child Assistance. These are the people that help sponsor orphanages and children in the foster homes.
Have you had any interest, have you worked any in that area other than?
Not directly, no, not directly.
Do you have any? You were swinging back over to comments we had talked about. One interesting experience, one funny experience with Gordon Cooper, and one with yourself. And I mentioned that if you thought of any more, that we might swing into it. Something that you feel is either funny or something that maybe had some drama at the time, or something that may be just a little sidelight to the personalities of the individuals or to the overall personality of the operation.
I don't know if you remember Apollo 12, but it was when the second lunar landing, Pete Conrad, Al Bean, Dick Gordon, and he took off in the weather. And I was one of the 4 people that gave the go. And Pete was in the spacecraft, and the front wasn't supposed to move through, but it did. But we were looking at the radar scopes and the Cape, and there was no thunderstorms near there. And we have very sensitive instrumentation all over the Cape that can show a lightning strike or a buildup. And I got down to T-minus 30 minutes. It had been raining, and it let up. But I looked up, and the clouds didn't look too thick, and I could see there was no cumulus cloud. So I talked to Pete and said, look, to continue counting, we're going to have to pull back the big swing arm, by the spacecraft. And I said, Pete, it looks like you got a few holes here, and I don't think you're going to have any cumulus clouds or have any problem. He said, okay, you can see better than I can, Tom. He said, you call it for me. So they called me up there, And there was three of us said, well, should we make the go for launch? And I said, well, from what I can see, let's make the go. Everybody else said go, and so I got back on the phone with Pete about minus 12 minutes, said we're going to do it. I said, okay. Had to lift off, you know. The booster went up, and just as it disappeared in the cloud, two huge bolts of lightning came zip, zip, you know, right down. And Pete yelled, uh-oh, I've got a warning lights on, and said, I think we've been struck by lightning. And he said, I think it happened again. And anyway, looked for a while, they're going to have to abort, but they got things worked out. And I said, oh, that was the worst decision I've ever made in my life. And we started, and later on, after he got in orbit, he said, tell Stafford I don't really buy his weather forecasting. But that was a unique thing. Really, the booster caused its own lightning. If the booster, that was the only lightning strike around the pad in plus or minus 6 hours. But the exhaust gas from the booster is ionized gas, and it conducted a ground for the static electricity was in the cloud to go to ground, and also between two cloud layers. That's the two lightning strikes. But anyway, Pete and I have always been great friends for years. In fact, he was an instructor at the Navy Test Pilot School, and I was an instructor at the Air Force Test Pilot School. He had the same job I had, so we've known each other for about 15 years now.
Oklahoma's made a lot of efforts in science, for instance, through the Frontiers of Science and
Right.
through an emphasis on science. As a person who has been involved in science and mathematics as you have, would you comment on Oklahoma from the standpoint of its efforts in science and what you feel this can do for the state?
Well, I think it was significant that a lot of the state leaders, in fact, I think Mr. Jim Webb is one of the ones that helped form this movement while he was here, to bring forth and put emphasis on science and education and acknowledge it. Now, over the period of time, this has certainly made our curriculum both in the high schools and colleges more effective in the state of Oklahoma. And the graduates of both the high schools and colleges today are so much more qualified than they were, let's say, when I graduated. And I think we're producing a far better citizen that can understand the technology that we live in today. And I think a lot of it can be attributed to the Frontiers of Science and the interest it's generated.
How do you feel that Oklahomans coming out of the Oklahoma colleges in science and then stand in comparison with people across the nation? How do you feel it?
Well, I think that they are, compared to across the nation, they are in excellent shape. Again, if you make it an individual college comparison, if you start to get versus institutions like MIT or Caltech, there's undoubtedly the level of instruction is not to the same quality there. However, say versus any other state university, I feel that we can sure compete.
Do you feel what do you feel are the possibilities for Oklahoma as a result of its scientific effort in getting, as they have in the past, industries that have a need for people trained in this area?
You know, most industries tend to flock to an area or tend to locate in an area where you do have resources, human resources. Now I'm talking resources with respect to technical backgrounds, to labor. Oklahoma, I think, has a quality workforce that you really get the return for the dollar you put out for labor. Plus, because of the Frontiers of Science, because of the quality the universities are putting out, we now have an academic community and a trained technical community that can support industry. And so I think, of course, the aerospace industry and technology all goes through cycles. And when the cycle's on the upswing again, I think you're going to see more and more industry locate in Oklahoma due to the resources that we have developed here.
You know, the state of Oklahoma, this area has been referred to as the Bible Belt sometimes in praise, or sometimes in ridicule, depending upon the type of person who might be making the statement. How do you feel about the general character of Oklahomans and such from the...
Oklahoma is a very conservative state. And with that, I think, goes a deep faith in religion from various religions that we have across the state. And I've been fortunate enough to travel in approximately 40 of the 50 states. The United States, since I completed Apollo 10, speaking to people in all different walks of life, from presidents of corporations to workers to colleges. And I feel that the atmosphere in Oklahoma is a very healthy one. I think that we are conservative and that we want to preserve the ideals and the institutions that have let us make the great progress we've made, but we're going to continue to have this progress. And with that, I feel that religion is a fundamental part of it. And I think people occasionally would like to ridicule it to say that religion stands in the way of progress, and I certainly disagree with that.
Well, certainly your experience has proved that it has certainly not stood in the way of your progress. This has been a very wonderful opportunity and a real honor for us, not only at Oklahoma Christian College, but for the state of Oklahoma, because the Oklahoma Living Legends belongs not just to Oklahoma Christian College, but it belongs to the state of Oklahoma. It is co-sponsored by the Oklahoma Historical Society, and certainly it's an honor and a privilege to have your interview and your comments on the Oklahoma Living Legends.
Thank you, Penn. It's been my pleasure to be here, believe me.